This episode of the podcast is brought to you by KC Consulting.
Have your cannabis brand's social media accounts been shut down by Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube for violating their quote-unquote community guidelines? Do you ever feel overwhelmed by having to continually create new content, then share that content to a targeted audience while responding to incoming comments and questions? When your marketing plans or lack thereof seem too daunting and overwhelming, it's important to have a trusted digital marketing partner to ensure your social media presence is healthy and active. KC Consulting is a premier social media marketing agency based in Dallas, Texas that specializes in strategy, content creation, channel management, paid advertising, graphic design, and SEO services that will take your social media marketing efforts to the next level. The agency is hyper-focused on helping cannabis companies navigate through the uncharted waters that they've been forced to endure due to the lack of FDA regulation in regards to sales and marketing messaging. Give them a call today to schedule a free consultation at 972-310-7471 or shoot them an email at social@kcconsulting.co. Don't take on the burden of managing your social media channels alone. Instead, take your social media marketing efforts to the next level with KC Consulting. Add value, not noise. KC Consulting. Hello, my fellow people of the plant. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Cannabinoid Connect podcast, your favorite podcast that includes industry-facing conversations with the industry's leading experts that aim to educate and inform the public regarding the plant's endless benefits. My guest today is Stephen Hawkins. He's the Interim CEO at the United States Cannabis Council. Ladies and gentlemen, I have a very special guest today. I have the Interim CEO of the United States Cannabis Council, Mr. Steve Hawkins. How are you, sir?
Kevin, I'm well. Glad to be on.
Yes, thank you so much for making time for me and my audience today. We have a lot of important topics to cover, some of which I think the work that, the U.S. Cannabis Council set out to do is maybe the most important work in the industry right now. And that is, advancing marijuana or cannabis legalization, as well as advancing social equity and restorative justice within the space as well. So, Steve, before we dive into that, let's first allow the audience to get a sense of your background. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your experience and advocacy in the cannabis space?
Well, I come to cannabis having spent 30 years, Kevin, working on policy issues as from the standpoint of civil and human rights, from the standpoint of criminal justice reform. And that work ultimately led me to cannabis because it so much intersects with civil rights issues in the United States, the racial disparity that has defined the war on cannabis over these last 50 years. And the impact on communities of color. It intersects with human rights, how the United States has positioned cannabis as well as other drugs as points for law enforcement, as opposed to more harm reduction models that we see in other parts of the world. So, it struck me from a human rights perspective, knowing how US policy has been exported around the world, quite frankly. And also from the criminal justice work that I've done and realizing, the millions of people who have been convicted of cannabis offenses over the last 50 years, and the 660,000 people who are still arrested for possession and other minor offenses each year in the United States. So all of that has brought me to cannabis, and I've directed the Marijuana Policy Project for the past 2.5 years, and now I'm thrilled to be helping to lead the U.S. Cannabis Council.
Mm-hmm. No, it's so interesting, and it's spot on when you say that cannabis injustice, specifically directed toward people of color, the minority communities, it does go hand in hand, with civil rights and racial injustice. Because if you've looked at the history, right, dating 100 years back, this plant was targeted at people of color, right? It was
Absolutely.
kind of that reefer madness era. And so what I think is interesting is that that's not as commonly known today, right?
Right.
Like we kind of look at prohibition of cannabis and all that kind of separate from racial injustice. Why do you think that is?
Well, maybe it has to do with the short memories that we always have in the United States. The history of the plant it is being lost, and some of that, as of you really just pointed out, Kevin, how cannabis got racialized. Again, late 20th century, cannabis was still legal in the United States. It was used in medicinal forms, and it wasn't until we saw Mexican nationals coming into the United States in the teens, and a smokable form of cannabis that became popular in the Jazz Age. That then we saw cannabis begin to be racialized, and the beginning of sort of targeting people of color for use. Yeah, a lot of that history has gotten lost. In some ways, we're the victims of success, right? Where we now have the beginning of an industry and people getting involved, and we don't even have to go back that far, Kevin. I can think about individuals on MPP's board who were arrested when they were students, lawyers that when they first took on clients around cannabis, they would meet in churches because they figured at least the cops wouldn't raid the church, right? And that's not ancient history. That's 20 years ago, right? But all of that is sort of, in our movement as we grow and mature. It's important to remember the long-term history, the sort of path that we've been on, because it still is with us, right? These are still some of the hurdles that I think we face when we start thinking about cannabis ultimately being legalized coast to coast.
Right. Yeah, and I want to go back to the point I made, and that is the U.S. Cannabis Council's like having one of the most important jobs, if the most important job right now, in terms of not only again advancing legal cannabis both federally or at the state level, but also that social equity component, right? Making sure that people who have been disenfranchised by the plant due to the regulations, that those wrongs are undone. So, talk to me a little bit about, U.S. Cannabis Council, like how this coalition kind of formulated and what y'all's overall mission and goals are, because we're seeing right now in New Jersey, right? Like I've seen 6,000 charges for weed are still happening as voters pass the ballot to legalize marijuana in the
Yes,
state. So, go ahead.
that's right. That's right. So what really gave the birth for the U.S. Cannabis Council was realizing, Kevin, that we are at this incredible moment, right? Jersey, uh, legalized cannabis through this referendum back in November through a ballot initiative, and on that same day we saw four other states, right? Three of those states were states that went for Donald Trump, right? So it shows that cannabis has become an issue that crosses political lines. We know that 68% of the American people are in support. And we know that Congress, we have alignment in Congress. We had the House of Representatives pass the MORE Act last year. We have Leader Schumer saying that, bringing a descheduling bill is at the top of his agenda. And we have in the White House, we have Kamala Harris, as vice president, who supported legalization when she was in the Senate. So in this opportune moment, we could not afford to be fragmented, um, and disconnected. So we have had in the past uh, any number of groups talking in Congress, right? And we wanted to try to bring together as many organizations and businesses as possible to really be able to talk as one in one voice. So we have 30 plus companies that are part of the U.S. Cannabis Council. We have 3 trade organizations. We have several advocacy groups that have come together. And the idea, again, Kevin, is to really be able to talk more with one voice, and really a voice that is going to push for descheduling in this Congress. We think we have that moment in front of us, and then to really also ensure that there are equity provisions and bills that come out, and that we don't lose track. And this goes back to what we were talking about. Don't lose track of the fact that communities were harmed over decades because of cannabis prohibition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and I'm looking at, like you mentioned, who the USCC is comprised of, right? And it's just a beautiful thing, because you've got some of the top leading multi-state operators in the United States, which they're the kind of dark horse cannabis story when it comes to the financial markets, right? Because everybody's talking about the Canadian LPs. But then you have people like yourself who have led the marijuana project, like you mentioned, and also U.S. Representative Earl Blumenauer from Oregon, Christian Cederberg, who's a partner at Vicente Cederberg, which is one of the largest cannabis law firms. So there's no doubt that the talent and everybody's there, and that's what makes it to set the stage for such a beautiful American story, I think, right? Because we should be leading the world when it comes to cannabis research and development of products that have such strong efficacy when it comes to medicinal and therapeutic properties.
I fully agree. I was just on the line before you and I got on with one of the trade groups out of Canada, wanting to work more closely with the U.S. Cannabis Council. And Kevin, that speaks to the fact that this is that cannabis has become a huge global market. And the reality is that the United States will start to lose market share if we don't change our attitude towards cannabis. Canada's going into its second or third year now, having legalized cannabis. Mexico is on the cusp of doing so, and the United States is still debating the issue in Congress.
Right. And to that point, so we've talked, a little bit touched on the opportunities, right, which are enormous, of course. And now let's talk about the challenges that it takes to get there, right? So let's first start with the political challenges, because you talk about, Congress, we need to kind of get our ducks in a row, and really kind of push this thing through so that the Senate can ultimately pass it and it hits Biden's desk, right?
Right.
My question is, when I think about political challenges, specifically in the Senate, right, or even in Congress, like, do you foresee maybe an inner battle between progressive left and moderate left when it comes to the social equity components of the bill?
There may be multiple challenges as we go forward. I mean, we certainly have seen, even in the state bills, right? As you're in New Jersey, you can see even
In Dallas.
yeah. Oh, you're in Dallas. Oh,
Yeah.
okay. You mentioned Jersey earlier.
Right.
Yeah, Texas is a little ways down the road, but
right.
yeah, I mean, there will be, I think, challenges even among Democrats and those who are left of center. I don't see that, though, as our biggest challenge, Kevin. Our biggest challenge in this Congress is going to be finding those 10 Republican senators who would support legalization. Now, we should have them, right? There's no reason why John Thune, who now, the day after election day, woke up to the reality that the electorate in South Dakota, including many, John Thune, Donald Trump Republicans, had voted to legalize cannabis, right? Now, John Thune's position now is that he is opposed. We have to change his mind, right? And we have to work with the citizens of South Dakota in that enterprise. And that also goes for Mike Rounds. It goes for someone like a Danes in Montana. So again, part of our biggest challenge, Kevin, is that the people are ahead of the politicians. Right?
Right.
The
There's
people,
no doubt about that. Yeah.
there is no doubt about it. I don't, if we could do ballot initiatives in every state in the country, this would be over in 2 years, right?
Right. Right.
Um, uh, but that's not the reality, and we still have to get cannabis descheduled in Congress. So our work, and hopefully we can get it done in this Congress. We have 2 years, is to win over those Republicans, and I think it's possible.
So that brings up a follow-up question on that, right? Because I've always been fascinated with this. Because when you look, like you mentioned, the public is way ahead of the policymakers. I say there's no doubt because we understand the economic benefits, the medicinal benefits, the environmental benefits that the plant presents, right? The many, numerous, endless applications on the material goods side once the infrastructure is in place, right? So I'm fascinated because is it purely political when it comes to the pushback? Or is it a lack of education? Is it the stigma? Like, what exactly is it? And then I'll we'll go from there. But
Yeah, I think it presents itself differently depending upon the politician, right? But what is interesting is the themes that I think, like I look at Governor Nome in South Dakota, who's been adamantly opposed. She's not coming at it from sort of a moralistic issue. Hers is more, well, I'm concerned about teen use, or I'm concerned about impaired driving. And I think that we've seen the shift towards these issues, which are fine, because I think our job is to address underage consumption, and our job is to
yeah,
do education. So I think that what we are faced now with is our politicians that um, you know are not, for reasons that become sort of easier to sort of hide behind, um, are refusing to take a position on cannabis legalization. And I think we just got to force that bluff, right, and
yeah.
address head on some of whatever the safety concerns might be. Um, Now, then we'll test, Kevin, whether that's the actual reason why
Well,
why they're opposed.
right. Well, and I've said this a couple of times now on the podcast where going back to the industry and the people's knowledge of the plant, that's why I
Right.
feel like it's so important for us to focus on education as an industry right now, because all like the microscope is getting on cannabis, right, from a federal level, a state level, even from a medicinal healthcare perspective. So we need to kind of use this information as ammo almost, to kind of start to talk and work with these policymakers and these decision makers before things are implemented.
Yeah, I think, and on your point of education, we've seen lawmakers change their attitudes when they've gone to visit, a a growing facility, or a processing plant, or our dispensary. There will be education to be done with some of the red state senators who I think are sort of doing a knee-jerk reaction to cannabis, but totally don't understand the sophistication of the industry, nor do they understand fully the therapeutics behind cannabis, or as you point out, environmental factors and so forth. So yeah, there is still an education element, that I think not only aimed at politicians, but there is still, I think, a broader public education to be done that will help to win over A segment of the public that still is worried about the stigma, or still worried about, are still, I think, responding to what, a few decades of propaganda, right, around
Right.
how the plant has been defined. So,
Hmm. Yeah, and operating in the cannabis industry, which is, one of the, if not the most highly regulated industries out there, we'll take every win we can get, right? And I've talked to experts and operators in the industry, and when we talk about descheduling, they're kind of like we'll take the win, right? But they're like it's almost not enough, and I can't get into the specifics as to why, but I would imagine just because it's still listed under the narcotics list, right? Even if it's Schedule 2 or Schedule 3, which maybe inhibit research and development. So is this kind of a first step? And then, because obviously we need to kind of walk before we run, especially at the federal government level, or is this kind of the plan for now, is just to stay at the descheduling level?
well, when I think of descheduling, I think of taking cannabis completely off of the controlled substance schedule,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So not to reschedule in any
Got
way.
you. Okay. So I'm mixing up the terms then. That's my apology. Okay.
No worries. But of course, that's not all, right? Because, you know, if if Congress deschedules, certainly in any state where people are operating, there will be some immediate relief, right? Business taxes will be deductible because cannabis will no longer be seen as trafficking and an illegal drug.
280E. Yeah.
280E, right? Banking will be normalized, right? Which, will change the opportunities for people of color because small business loans, Community Reinvestment Act, other state and municipal incentives that exist. But we'll still have the hard work of getting all the other states to legalize. But that would be certainly sped up, right? I mean, once the federal wall falls, there, it will change the dynamic in several states, right? In terms of sort of speeding up and accelerating their process towards legalization.
What do you foresee happening first? I mean, do you see 280E going away? Do you see safe banking coming first? Um,
I'm taking the lead of leaders in Congress, right? I mean, if Schumer wants to start with a Booker Schumer Wyden bill where you have Cory Booker, who's been the champion around racial and criminal justice in the Senate. You got Chuck Schumer, the leader of the Senate, and you got Wyden, who's over finance. If they want to start off with descheduling, hey, that's where we should be starting. Um, Beyond that, though, sure, there's banking, right? But if we get descheduling, it will take care of banking. It'll take care of 280E. And the moment is now. I mean, I think, Kevin, we got to remember that everything that's still happening in the states keeps informing Congress, right? And right now we have at least a half dozen states that are actively trying to legalize over these next few months, right? From Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, to New Mexico, Maryland, and Virginia, which is gonna, who would have thought that Virginia
I know.
would just jump ahead of New York, right?
Right. It reinforces your bipartisan comment, right? I mean, at the state and local level, they're
Yeah,
seeing the tax revenue benefits. I mean,
right,
you
right.
know,
So all of that will continue to shape Congress. Like if we're talking about in June, three new states that have legalized through the legislative process, that has impact back in Congress, right? Our point at the end of the day is this is inevitable, right? It's happening, right? The federal government needs to intervene and deschedule, help create whatever is going to be the federal regulatory system. Hopefully that's a light footprint, and really send it back to the states where the states have been developing their own body of regulation and taxation and all of that. So
Hmm.
so that's the goal. That is the goal. And I think we
Yeah.
have 2 years to get it done.
Yeah, hopefully, like you said, there's a light footprint of the regulation, but also there is that willingness of collaboration with the legacy operators and the people that have done this for a while and kind of understand the plant, because
Right.
it is an anomaly when it comes to the science. I mean, it's insane, what it can do, as we touched on earlier.
Yeah. Yeah. There has been a federal research bill that is that may be on its own separate track towards further study of cannabis. I'm USCC is certainly supportive of it. We just don't want to see things end with research, right?
Right.
But there needs to be descheduling and further research, to be sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. So Steve, just to wrap up here, I want to,
Sure.
we touched on, the efforts that USCC is taking in terms of, legalization, working with our policymakers. And we touched on the social equity side, but I want to dive into that more. So, why don't you talk about specifically what USCC is doing to advance social equity and restorative justice in cannabis?
Well, I'll look at it, and I think the three sort of core areas of social equity. First area is around justice reform, and what I mean by that is decriminalization, expungement, de-incarceration for people who are still in prison and jail. So our very first step, our very first act was to send a letter that went out this week to President Biden, um, joined by Normal, joined by the National Cannabis Industry Association, joined by Weldon Angelos, who had his sentence commuted by Trump, and I mean, commuted by Biden and then pardoned by Trump, Alice Johnson, um, and others, to say to President Biden, just a grand gesture in this space would be to just do a blanket pardon of anybody who has a low-level cannabis offense in the federal system. We don't have to spend months or years sending them through every procedural hurdle, just like Governor Pritzker did in Illinois, Kevin, at the end of at the end of last year. Just a huge pardon. The president of the United States has that power to just do a sweeping blanket. Jimmy Carter did that with the draft resistors who went to Canada in the Vietnam War.
Wow.
The act that he did as president, blanket pardon of everybody who had
It
who had fled Canada.
totally makes sense. I mean,
Yeah,
nonviolent, cannabis related crimes, low level offenses, why fill
right.
up our prison systems and whatnot with these petty
Yeah,
offenses when others are making money from it and it's a
yeah,
legitimized business,
yeah. So two other things on social equity, quickly. One, certainly the large issue for many folks is how are Black and brown business owners going to be able um, to grow their businesses and survive, right?
Hmm.
And also and then also, how does this industry begin to look like America, right?
Right.
Diversity in staff, and not just low-level staff, but C-suite. Who's on your board of directors? you know who's part of your supply chain, who are your consultants, who are your lawyers, um, and USCC will be, every member will ultimately join into a diversity, equity, and inclusion sort of uh, code of conduct. We have several companies like Curaleaf that just launched a huge effort this past week called Rooted in Good. We have Ease that has the Momentum program now, which has helped now, a couple of dozen, people in different parts of the country strengthen their businesses. We want to model all of those programs more, Kevin. We want to put some money into creating pipelines, coming up from like historically Black colleges and universities through community colleges into the industry. And we're going to be building out a social equity committee that will be made up of both board members, but then other people not on the board, but to help think through, in hopefully much more detail than we've seen, what can be some very tangible social equity programs that that are about community empowerment. And then the last piece is, resources that go back to those communities that have been harmed by cannabis prohibition. I think there's a role for USCC members directly through support of community projects and efforts on the ground. But there's also a huge role that we must all continue to advocate with the tax dollars that states raise, right? Some of those dollars need to be able to flow back into communities that were harmed, whether it's for reentry services for people coming out of jail and prison, whether it's for scholarship funds. The University of Maryland, I mean, not University of Maryland, but Maryland as a state, as they're now, as there's a debate now to legalize here, they're looking at what, about $200 million in tax revenue every year. And the idea is to put 20% of that, should be be $40 million plus every year back into the 4 historically Black colleges and universities here. And that could, just have a huge impact over decades, right? So a lot of creative ways to, think about how we provide support for communities that were harmed. And I'm excited at the thought of USCC being involved in all of those ways.
Yeah, I mean, I go back to, I can't think of a more American story than, something that harmed certain communities, minority groups for so long. And now that it's becoming a legitimized business, you have organizations like USCC who are stepping up and making that a priority as we look to reform and legalize. And it's great, the focus areas that you mentioned, right? You talked about diversity and inclusion of people of color, right? You talked about community involvement and giving back into the community, and then also funneling some of those tax dollars back into communities that were affected. I mean, that to me sounds like something that is a good measure to put in place, as the industry evolves. So really appreciate your time today, Steve.
It's been a pleasure.
And this was so informative. I mean, I saw the press release and I was like, I got to talk to these guys and just, hear all of the great work that they're doing and plan to continue to do for the industry. So is there anything that you want to leave the audience with before we sign off?
Well, just, stay tuned. Folks will be hearing more good things about the U.S. Cannabis Council. And Kevin, I look forward to being back on the show at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll have to get you and maybe some other team members. We'll do like a whole group thing. So
cool. Sounds great.
Awesome. Hey, well, thank you again. And thank you all for listening.
All right.
Bye.